Before the great railroads stitched together east and west, or the magnificent interstate highway system we know today crisscrossed the continent, there were only two options for travel in the early United States: roads and rivers. Quite often the roads were simple dirt trails between cities. Most commercial transportation, or for lack of a better term, first-class travel, utilized the many rivers of the East Coast and plied the bays and shores to get from major city to major city. If you wanted to go somewhere off the beaten path, namely the West, you had one major obstacle between you and the vast interior: the Appalachian Mountains. While roads could be cut across the forests and find paths between the peaks, rivers don't flow uphill. Before rails, it was impractical to get goods like grain, ore, and coal in bulk back and forth across these mountain roads, necessitating another solution: canals. The transportation canals I'm talking about have their origins fundamentally in the irrigation canals necessary for large-scale agriculture. The oldest irrigation canals date back to the Neolithic Samara culture from about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, discovered at the Chogamami site in Iraq. The Bronze Age Indus Valley civilization had complex systems of canals and reservoirs, which allowed for one of the largest cities at the time, Mohenjo-Daro, to be constructed. Over 4,000 years ago, during the Old Kingdom period, the Egyptians built canals to bypass cataracts on the Nile. The height of ancient canal building were the Chinese canal projects, constructed during the spring and autumn period some 2,500 years ago by the Zhou emperors, to maintain their empire and collect tribute from their many unruly vassal states. The absolute pinnacle of Chinese canal building is the Grand Canal, completed by Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty in the early 7th century. At over 1,000 miles long, the Grand Canal stretches from Beijing in the north to Ningbo in the south, connecting 5 rivers and rising to heights of over 138 feet above sea level in the foothills of Shandong to the west, with sections still in use today. In Europe, the first transportation canals were constructed in Greece. The Persian Emperor Xerxes the Great ordered the construction of the Xerxes Canal, cutting Mount Athos from the Greek mainland following the loss of a fleet during a previous invasion. Later, the ancient Suez Canal used Greek-designed locks to connect the Nile River and Red Sea. Early European canal design reached the new height under the Romans, mostly due to Roman concrete, which differs from the concrete you can get at the hardware store, as Roman concrete can set and harden under water due to the addition of volcanic ash. The Romans used canals for intercoastal transportation primarily, but also to bypass marshland, as with the Bourne-Morton Canal in Britain, or to bypass the cataracts on the Danube on the modern Serbian-Romanian border. With the fall of Rome, European canal building all but disappeared until the end of the 8th century under Charlemagne. Constructed ahead of his subjugation of the Saxons and Avars, the Fossa Carolina, or Karlsgraben in Bavaria, connected the Swabian Rosat River on the Rhine to the Altamul River on the Danube, though there is some debate if the project actually succeeded, with contemporary sources contradicting each other. In 10th century Anglo-Saxon England, St. Dunstan, then the abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, had the Glastonbury Canal constructed to bring stone and other construction materials to expand the monastery. The canal remained in use to transport supplies to the abbey until King Henry VIII disestablished the abbey in 1539. In 1139, King Henry I reconstructed the 2nd century Roman Fosse Dyke in Lincolnshire, which connected the Trent River to Lincoln town centre. Following a refurbishment in 1671, The Fosse Dyke may be the oldest canal still in use in England, with grain being shipped through the canal as recently as 1972. The oldest European-built canal in America is the Mother Brook. Constructed between 1639 and 1641, the Mother Brook was originally a mill race for Dedham, Massachusetts, which lacked the sufficient water power for a grist mill of any use. The settlers dug a 4,000-foot canal from the Charles River to the Neponset River, with a change in altitude of 45 feet in the first mile providing more than enough power for their new mill. As a taxpayer-funded community project, the Dedham Grist Mill was the first public utility in the United States, and residents could grind corn for a reduced upkeep fee. In later centuries, the Mother Brook would make Dedham an industrial powerhouse, even among the many mill towns of New England. Beginning in 1757 with the opening of the Sankey Canal up the River Mersey from Liverpool, canal mania struck Britain. As canals facilitated the easy transportation of food, coal, and other raw materials from the hinterlands to the rapidly growing industrial centers, they became indispensable to Britain's industrial revolution. By the end of the century, Britain's extensive canal networks were the envy of the world and emulated extensively. Despite the plans and wishes of many colonial administrators, the American colonies did not construct any transportation canals under British rule. Following the end of the Revolutionary War, the Americans began to more seriously consider canal projects, and it wasn't uncommon for British-trained engineers to try and ply their trade in the new United States. The first navigable and financially successful canal in the United States was the South Hadley Canal. Constructed by the proprietors of the locks and canals on the Connecticut River in 1795 in western Massachusetts, the South Hadley Canal bypassed the Holyoke Great Falls. The project used an inclined plane powered by water wheels to hoist flatboats up the steep 50-foot drop, using methods pioneered by the Keatley Canal in Shropshire, England. With a toll of 75 cents per ton, the canal made $3,100 in its first year alone, facilitating the development of the river. Within 10 years, traffic necessitated the canal's expansion, replacing the inclined plane with a more conventional series of locks. The Middlesex Canal, connecting Lowell on the Merrimack River through the Concord River at North Billerica to Boston Harbor through the Mystic River at Medford, was the first civil engineering project of its type in the United States. Championed by Revolutionary War hero Henry Knox, the 27-mile canal took nearly 10 years to build, with groundbreaking in 1794 and the final leg into the Charles River being finished in 1802. The engineers, familiar with Roman engineering, imported volcanic ash at great expense from St. Eustatius for their hydraulic cement, and devised hinged dump bed carts to better move dirt. The Middlesex Canal operated until the mid-19th century, overtaken by trains, and little of the canal remains due to urban development. The North was not exclusively the center of canal building in the United States. Starting in 1793, the Dismal Swamp Canal Company began trying to connect the Chesapeake Bay via the Elizabeth River in Virginia to the Pasquotank River that flows into the Albemarle Sound, linking much of North Carolina's most economically active areas to the major shipping hub of Baltimore without risking travel through open ocean. The Dismal Swamp Canal had a whole different challenge to the northern canals, namely the Great Dismal Swamp. At the time, about 1 million acres of dense, ancient stands of bald cypress, white cedar, and red maple. It took the company over 12 years to complete the canal, all 22 miles of which was dug entirely by hand using slaves rented from local plantations. Upon opening in 1905, the canal facilitated logging and draining operations in the swamp. The Dismal Swamp Canal was sold to the federal government in 1929 and is still maintained and operated by the Army Corps of Engineers as part of the Intercoastal Waterway, making it the oldest continually operating canal in the United States. The crown jewel of the canals built in the early Republic is the Erie Canal, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie via the Mohawk River and Lake Oneida through its drainage, the Oneida River, west to the Niagara River. The Mohawk Valley had long been an important connective pathway between the East Coast and interior, carved over 13,000 years ago by the catastrophic meltwater discharge from the proglacial Lake Iroquois, cutting between the Catskills and Adirondacks, creating one of the major passages through the Appalachian Mountains. Before the canal, westward travelers would go up the Mohawk River to Rome, where then they would take the Oneida Carry, a portage trail to Wood Creek, where boats could be loaded and brought down the creek to Lake Oneida. This vital corridor proved to be fragile when, during the French and Indian War, French Canadians captured and destroyed the fortifications protecting the Oneida Carry, which also acted as warehouses, preventing the Americans from attacking Upper Canada by land. The same problem reared its head again during the War of 1812, when the Americans were unable to get enough men and materiel to the northwest, leaving the Western Army undersupplied and vulnerable, being one of the many factors in America's initial failures in the region during the war. Following the conclusion of hostilities, many within New York State, most importantly Governor of New York DeWitt Clinton, sought a better way to transport goods west. Clinton was convinced to build a canal by Jesse Hawley, a grain merchant from Geneva who went broke trying to get grain over the Oneida Carry, and Joseph Ellicott, an agent for the Holland Land Company in Batavia, who realized a canal connecting Lake Erie to New York City would increase the value of the land he was trying to sell in western New York, bringing with him support from the company's wealthy Dutch investors. Currently, the waterway we call the Erie Canal is actually the New York State Barge Canal, the third version of the canal. The first Erie Canal took a more direct route to Lake Erie for a total distance of 360 miles. In contrast, the modern canal makes greater use of canalized rivers. Governor Clinton secured $7 million in funding for the project from the state legislature in 1817, starting construction on the 4th of July that same year. It took the construction crews 2 years to excavate the first 15 miles between Utica and Rome. At that rate, it would take over 30 years to dig the canal, and the project began to garner derision. Previously in 1809, during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, the expense of the canal led President Jefferson to say the project was little short of madness, and that it was 100 years too early technologically, a sentiment echoed by many in New York and elsewhere, with Clinton receiving harsh criticism for wasting taxpayer money, earning the project the nickname Clinton's Folly and DeWitt's Ditch. The Erie Canal project had three major problems: labor, expertise, and good old geography. The problem with labor was simply that America had little in the way of skilled workers familiar with canal construction. This was, after all, one of the first real projects of its kind and scope in the United States. The previous Middlesex Canal only had to go a few miles, connecting two rivers through well-settled country. The Erie Canal, while relying on the Mohawk River up to Utica, had to build its own waterway through wilderness until it reached the Tonawanda Creek. Second, expertise, stemming from the same problem but affecting planning. A mistake from the work crews usually couldn't sink the whole project, but a mistake in choosing the wrong way could. The surveyors, Benjamin Wright and James Geddes, were judges specializing in settling land disputes and had no experience using the tools required to survey for canals, simply having to figure it out on their own. The project lacked any civil engineers, the only one with any canal building experience on the project being Benjamin Wright, who worked previously with English engineer William Weston for a project of dams and locks on the Mohawk that fell through over a decade previously, not having any hands-on experience. To remedy this, Canvas White, a local surveyor and amateur engineer, was sent to England to study canal building. The other engineer, Nathan Roberts, was a land speculator who taught math, though the canal did catch a break with the project's geologist, Amos Eaton, a brilliant naturalist who would go on to co-found the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Despite these human failings, the more daunting obstacles came from the land itself. The canal path was mostly through very lightly developed land. By 1817, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, namely the Seneca under Red Jacket, had only left New York, save for 10 reservations, with the conclusion of the Treaty of Big Tree 20 years earlier in 1797. At this time, western New York was virgin old-growth forests, punctuated by wetlands. While it took 2 years to get from Utica to Rome, lands that had been settled by German immigrants since the 1760s, the stretch from Syracuse west would be a totally different animal to what the work crews previously experienced. Soon, though, word of the project would get around, and at its height, about 9,000 men worked on the canal, about 5,000 of which were Irish immigrants, many of whom came specifically to find work building the canal. During construction, Canvas White would discover a way to make Roman-style concrete from local materials, namely Rosendale cement, a product of the fine-grained ancient Rondout Formation dolomite found in Ulster County, as opposed to importing volcanic ash from elsewhere. Despite the previous rate of 15 miles in 2 years, the second major leg of the canal, connecting Rome to Syracuse, was completed by 1820. The workers immediately made their way west, encountering one of the major blockages in construction, the Montezuma Marsh. The area was named after the hilltop home of Dr. Peter Clark, who named his home after the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II and his palace, with eventually the hill, village, and marsh all acquiring the name Montezuma. The mudflats seep out of Lake Cayuga, the longest of the Finger Lakes, where it joins the Seneca River flowing east to the Oswego that now makes up the current canal path, but was bypassed at the time. When the workmen first got there in summer, the marsh was infested with mosquitoes that carried swamp fever, some kind of malaria. Despite a rumor that over 1,000 workers had died, no reports or physical evidence corroborating such a high death toll exists. That said, work was stopped until October, when the cold killed the mosquitoes and firmed up the mud enough to actually dig the canal without the sides falling in. Once through the Montezuma Marsh, the next problem came from the Iron Dequock Creek and Genesee River. In later eras, the expanded Erie Canal would simply cut through these obstacles, but in the original Erie Canal, the section between Penfield and Rochester required a 1,300-foot-long embankment to run 75 feet above the creek, which itself ran through a deep glacial valley, all while ascending 30 feet through 5 locks before crossing the Genesee River Valley at Rochester. Once at Rochester, the canal continued through an 800-foot-long by 17.5-foot-wide stone aqueduct supported by 11 pillars. The successor aqueduct, built in the mid-1830s during the expansion project, now carries Broad Street across the Genesee in downtown Rochester. After Rochester, the final obstacle for the Erie Canal was the formidable Niagara Escarpment, an 80-foot cliff that stretched from just west of Rochester through Ontario to that weird little spike in Wisconsin, with the Niagara Falls being the most prominent feature of the cliff. Utilizing a natural dip in the cliff at modern-day Lockport, the canal still required a 5-step stairlock called the Flight of 5 Locks to traverse the 60-foot drop down to the cliff base. Once these were complete, the Erie Canal turned south for about 7 miles before connecting to the Tonawanda Creek at Pendleton. From there, the canal made its way down the creek to the Niagara River, where it would proceed south upriver to the Black Rock Lock at Unity Island and on to the burgeoning city of Buffalo on Lake Erie, in turn connecting markets as far away as Chicago to the harbors of New York City. The project had taken 8 years to complete, officially opening on October 26, 1825, though the sections were in use the second they finished. Coming in at $7.1 million for 350 miles of canal, the project had nearly ruined Governor Clinton's political career, with the Democratic Republicans not nominating him for re-election in 1822. Clinton only narrowly made a comeback in 1824, with the Tammany Hall-backed Bucktail faction led by Martin Van Buren breathing down his neck and seeking his removal from the Canal Commission. Though, once the Erie Canal was complete, Clinton was the political darling of rural New Yorkers, a constituency he had previously been at odds with, and untouchable in New York state politics, winning the next 2 elections before passing in office from heart failure at the age of 58. The Erie Canal was a great benefit to New York State, reducing the cost to move freight between Manhattan and Buffalo about 90%. The tolls vastly exceeded the interest on New York's loan, and while the state didn't believe the canal would pay for itself, it did by the end of 1837. These tolls came from the canal operating at pretty much maximum capacity during that time, with the first expansion project starting in 1834. Unlike other canals, the Erie Canal was only supplanted in 1959, following the construction of another canal, the St. Lawrence Seaway, which provided direct access to Lake Ontario for larger ships. Today, the Erie Canal has been left for mostly recreational purposes as part of the Intracoastal Waterway, and as part of New York State's heritage, with the Erie Canal being designated the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor in 2000, though the canal does still move freight at a much reduced capacity to its heyday. The immediate success seen by New York State, who constructed their canal without federal funding, kicked off a frenzy of sometimes ill-conceived canal-building projects. While the majority of successful canals were still private enterprises, like New Jersey's Morris Canal and Pennsylvania's Lehigh Canal, both primarily carrying anthracite coal from the Pennsylvania hinterlands to the bustling industrial cities of the coast. On the other hand, canals like the Ohio and Erie Canal, owned by Ohio, completed in 1832, the Wabash and Erie Canal, owned by Indiana, or Pennsylvania's main line of public works, a network of canals and rivers, were public good ventures that fell into the category of seemed like a good idea at the time, and all 3 nearly bankrupting their respective states. Even before the opening of the Erie Canal, the merchants of Philadelphia realized that New York was about to eat their breakfast, lunch, and dinner once the canal was fully opened. The wealthy citizens devised a plan to build their own canal to connect Pittsburgh and the Ohio River to Philadelphia and the Delaware River, prodding the state to pay for it in 1824. The Pennsylvania Canal project had some advantages and disadvantages compared to the Erie Canal. First, Pennsylvania had more rivers that were closer together, so the majority of the waterways needed were already there in rivers. That said, the main problem came from Pennsylvania's many ridges and valleys, culminating with the formidable Allegheny Front. The first leg of the canal took the Schuylkill River up to Reading, where it entered the Union Canal. The Union Canal, a project that preceded the main line by more than 20 years, and necessitated the building of the oldest transportation tunnel in the country, went west through the Lebanon Valley to the Sawatara Creek, entering the Susquehanna River at Middletown, just south of the state capital, Harrisburg. From Harrisburg, the canal path went up the Susquehanna River to the Juniata River at Duncannon, then all the way up the Frankston Branch to Hollidaysburg, where the Pennsylvania Canal encountered the Allegheny Front. Near Hollidaysburg was an important feature, the Blair Gap. Originally used during the Revolutionary War as a lesser-known but still accessible path west, the Blair Gap was notable as even wagons could pass through it. From Hollidaysburg, the climb to the summit was 1,399 feet, necessitating a new way to do an old thing, an inclined plane to get loaded barges up and down the gap. The builders constructed a series of 5 cable railroads which picked up barges and then brought them to Johnstown, where the barges could then be refloated on the Conemaugh River, where the barges had an easy time going downriver to the Allegheny, subsequently ending up in Pittsburgh and the Ohio River, cutting the journey from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia from 23 days with a horse and wagon to just 4 days. The Pennsylvania Canal was not nearly as successful as the Erie Canal, and nearly bankrupted the state. Upon the completion of the Allegheny Portage in 1834, the main east-west action of the canal was complete, but years of necessary tweaks and improvements followed, and the canal wasn't officially complete until 1840. The 1830s were a big decade for steam locomotives, with the Norris Locomotive Works of Philadelphia unveiling their proof-of-concept locomotive, George Washington, which ran on the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad for the first time on July 10, 1836, pulling itself and 19,000 pounds of cargo up the Belmont Plain at 15 miles per hour. This was an astounding feat that mortally wounded not only the Pennsylvania Canal, but practically all canals around the world, and ushered in the age of rail in America. On June 25, 1857, the state of Pennsylvania would sell the main line of public works and its 275 miles of canal to the private Pennsylvania Railroad Company. The next year, the Allegheny Portage was pulled up for scrap and the canals abandoned in favor of the new railroad that passed through Altoona to the north. America is a land obsessed with everything new and bigger and faster, with little time for the past and its peculiar and in some ways foreign problems. Trains today are treated with contempt, passenger rail a joke in the face of cheap and fast airplanes that can take you from New York to Los Angeles in only 6.5 hours for under $200. As opposed to Amtrak's 76-hour journey for $447. This juxtaposition gives us a glimpse to how the slow canal barges must have looked from a train car speeding by, or how the canal barges effortlessly ascending locks must have looked to the horse and cart struggling uphill, as Americans today literally look down on trains that only a century ago were the best we had, as perhaps future travelers themselves will too look down on air travel. Thank you for watching. If you could do me a favor and like the video, that would be really cool. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribing to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles is the best way to do it. If you have a comment or topic from American history you'd like to see explored, feel free to leave it down below. Thank you again.